kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and forever.
We are in the season of the resurrection, Paschal Tide. And so we'll begin with one of the hymns that is appropriate for this season that is used in the Byzantine Church. And then also the hymn of this week. This week for us is the week of the ointment-bearing women. And so the ones who were the first witnesses of the resurrection. And so, of course, that's kind of ties right into the topic today for the resurrection appearances. And so let us begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The angel exclaimed to her, full of grace, "Rejoice, O pure Virgin," and again I say rejoice. "Your Son is risen from the grave on the third day, and has raised the dead. Rejoice, all you nations. Shine in splendor, O New Jerusalem, for the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. O Zion, now dance and be glad, and you, pure Theotokos, rejoice in the resurrection of your Son. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit." The angel standing by the tomb cried out to the myrrh-bearing women, "Myrrh is fitting for the dead, but Christ has shown himself not subject to corruption. So now cry out, the Lord is risen, bestowing great mercy upon the world. Now and ever and forever, amen. Although you descended into the grave, O immortal one, you destroyed Hades' power. You arose as a victor, O Christ God. You exclaimed to the myrrh-bearing women, rejoice. You gave peace to your apostles and granted resurrection to the fallen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So the topic that we place before ourselves, and this is an interesting, I think it's a very interesting subject, because this is one of the questions that many people are not sure even how to ask. You know, how is Jesus's appearance after the resurrection? Because they're in the gospel, so we don't have too much of a description. And so a lot of it we kind of assume. So, you think, well, according to the teachings of the church, the body that was buried in the tomb was resurrected. So it's the same Jesus, physically speaking, the same body. But then why are some people unable to recognize him? And why does he tell Mary Magdalene, don't touch me? So there are mysterious things in the resurrection, in the events of the resurrection, that cause us to think, okay, there might be something a little bit different. And I think that's a fair assumption to make, because obviously there is something different. A body that has died did not previously rise from the dead, so there obviously is something different. And then, of course, I think the big difference too, at least we can kind of put that into our theological gears. The big difference is that this body raised will no longer die. So it is not like Lazarus who was raised from the dead, but then aged and died, or Jairus's daughter, or the son of the widow from Nain. All of these were raised, and they lived out their life only to die at some point. But Jesus's body, Jesus, no, he's risen, and no longer will that body be subject to death and corruption. And we hear corruption a lot. That's it's kind of a funny word because there is a, even though we try to say there isn't church talk, and there are church words, but there is also, we talk about corruption and you think about corrupt politicians. So we don't, when we say corruption about the body of Jesus, corruption actually means decay. So all of that which would physically happen to a body after death, that is no longer a part of the body of Christ after his resurrection. So that's like one of the things that when we see, Jesus's body is perfected, except for some things. So he still has the wounds. The wounds remain. They didn't get healed completely. And that's not because the body was somehow imperfect and it could not heal itself, but rather it's because that was necessary to prove that he had died and then risen. And so those remain as kind of, those are the battle scars, literally, but they are not festering or bleeding or decaying. Because even those wounds are now in some, mystical way perfect. And so we see that. I actually looked, one of the icons here in the church has this image of the resurrected Christ surrounded by recent saints from Ukraine. And these were saints that died during communism. And so, but the image, the main thing here is this image of Christ in the resurrection. And he has around himself that funky mandorla, that halo that goes all around his body. And so when we see that in icons, it means that this is a mystical reality, not something that it can be seen by human eyes. And that's not talking so much, I think it's more of a reflection on some other reality. So if you notice in the icon, there is here out of his side is coming like a band of light. So it is done with gold, and the image is more like the Transfiguration. And that's also, that goes for the images of the resurrection. The earliest images of the resurrection did not consist of showing Jesus jumping out of the tomb or out of the cave, but rather it showed his image surrounded by a mandorla, which was either almond shaped or it was completely round, and it showed him raising Adam and Eve. And so that was kind of the first part of the restoration of humanity, was that now Adam and Eve, where it all began, where the whole problem of death begins, with them resurrection also begins, restoration. And so we'll find, like, if you Google, like oldest images of the resurrection, both in, the Eastern Christian tradition, but also in the Western church, like medieval paintings, you'll find the same things. Beautiful images of Adam and Eve, usually depicted like in the jaws of death, which is literally a mouth. And they are being pulled out of it by the hand of Jesus. And again, it's revealed in this mandorla that surrounds the body. So then, that's the artistic tradition, and when it comes to depicting how Jesus appeared after his resurrection. But there are some signs in the gospel tradition. There are some hints which tell us a little bit more about how Jesus looked, because obviously he looked a little different. We can assume that, but he also was not immediately recognized. And that's not really all that important. It doesn't really mean that he looked different. It doesn't mean that he looked like, all of a sudden, all the, 33 years of wrinkles, all of that was taken away. It doesn't mean that he necessarily changed in his physical aspect. So what the church teaches is that after resurrection, the body of Jesus was glorified. And so glorified means that it no longer had the same relationship with earthly, terrestrial things, such as food, such as illness, such as aging. So his body was, in that sense, it was not changed, but it was perfected. And so, and that is the reason why he tells Mary not to touch him. Mary Magdalene, who is the first of the women disciples to see Jesus. So when he speaks to her, she doesn't initially know it's him. She takes him for a gardener and inquires where he may have placed the body of Jesus. And so she doesn't recognize him. Again, and that's nothing about him looking different. It is just that even the way that he is perceived by mere human eyes, so people who are earthly, terrestrial, because we are tied to the earth by virtue of our humanity, we are not glorified, we are not yet transfigured. So Mary also at that time was still firmly rooted to the earth. So even her eyes can't interact with what is now the glorified body of Jesus. And it only happens when Jesus wills it. So she sees him, but she does not know him until he wills that she see him. So it's in a sense, it's kind of you could say it is an apparition of sorts, even though he is physical. He is not just, a spiritual apparition. And so when he says to her, and this is one of the problems of translation, that when it comes to the translation of biblical texts, we translate, we try to come up with a correct understanding, but there are usually multiple versions that we can take from it. And so one of the translations, which is probably, I would say, a more accurate one, is "do not cling to me." And so, because obviously, Mary has seen Jesus die on the cross. She has seen him buried. In a sense, she has come to terms that he is gone. And so what happens when he returns to her? Well, of course, she wants to throw herself at him, and hang on to him, to make sure that he is really real. So the idea of, do not touch me, that's it comes across a little I don't know, superficial. It's just doesn't express that emotional intensity of what was happening when Mary realized that this was Jesus. And we do get a glimpse into the intensity when she calls him in Syriac and Aramaic. She calls him Rabboni, which literally means my dearest teacher. So it is an honorific with a very personal, intimate expression. So this clinging onto Jesus, although it has a physical expression, there is also a certain spiritual reality that is being expressed. That basically the period that Jesus spends from his resurrection to his ascension and return to heaven, to his Father, that period is a period of transition. It is a period where he who became incarnate and walked among us as a man, experiencing everything that we experience, now after resurrection, he walked among us as God. And so it was different. And so he was already in that phase of moving towards heaven, towards that return to the presence of God. And so when he says, don't cling to me, I think that has more to do with the reality that although his body, in a sense, for its own history and past is of the earth, it is no longer of the earth, but it now belongs to heaven. And now the fathers, they affirm that understanding. When we read the Paschal homily of St. John Chrysostom, so he makes specific reference to that death took something from the earth and then discovered that it was biting into something of heaven. And so that's in reference to the body of Jesus. So it is a theme that we see echoed in the early church. There is this understanding that it's a grappling with the idea of what is different in Jesus's appearance, so to speak. And so we could kind of say, well, technically, to our eyes, or to the eyes of his disciples, there wasn't a great physical difference once you wrapped your mind around the fact that he was dead and had risen from the dead. I mean, that's a lot to kind of take in anyway. But as far as the physical aspect, from the human standpoint, we could just say, okay, that he wasn't that different. Now, from the metaphysical aspect, so, that which is the spiritual reality, so that he was in complete control of his uh, becoming visible to human beings, that's all very different. That's all something that speaks to a dramatic change. And again, with Jesus, at this point, he's not like more God than man. He's still God 100% and man 100%. He was the same before his death and before his death. He was 100% man, 100% God. So none of that has changed, but it's just what is now more perceivable in him. Before his death, it was his humanity. With a couple of points, the baptism of Christ, his transfiguration, there were moments when the divinity kind of shone stronger. But it was primarily his humanity that was visible. And then after his resurrection, now the focus was on his divinity, not always in what was seen, but in what he could now do in revealing himself. So that is a little bit of a change. So the way that we would express this, looking at the patristic expressions used. So Jesus's resurrected body was transfigured and incorruptible. So transfigured is about light. And that expression of light is the expression of his divinity. And it is, of course, it's not accidental that we're using the same word that we use for the transfiguration on Mount Tabor. So there he shone in light, and his apostles, they saw as much as they could, but they became confused. They became afraid. So the incorruptibility, it means literally his body is no longer subject to decay. So his body was not, let's say, visible unless he willed to show himself. So it doesn't mean that he was invisible, but rather it means that he was not recognized unless he willed to be recognized. His body was completely and fully human, but it is glorified in every way, and it shows to us the kind of body each believer will have at the final great resurrection of all. And that is paraphrased from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 42 and following. Now, there are some other hints too. In studying the Gospels, and especially when you do like the continuous reading, there are many who have done the readings of the Gospels in their entirety, day by day, a little bit. And so one thing that you realize is that the Gospels are, I don't want to say this like irreverently, but they're a bit of a patchwork, they're kind of like one of those quilts made from many different pieces. And biblical scholars, they try to figure out not so much what is original and what might not be, but they try to figure out where the different events described in the Gospels fit. There's no doubt that some of the miracles of Jesus that are in the Gospel tradition preserved before his death, and resurrection actually occurred after his death and resurrection. And scholars know about that because of words. The words are a hint as far as the placement and timing of different events. And so one of the things that we see in the gospel tradition as important is Galilee, because remember that not only did the angels tell the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee where they will see him, but Jesus himself told the women, tell the disciples to go to Galilee where they will see me. So Galilee was a big deal. And the stories that we do have from after the resurrection of Christ. So one of the important places is the Sea of Galilee. And so, we have very specific events that happen there on the seashore. We don't know, there's conjecture as to why is that an important place of encounter. One could say it's a coming full circle. After all, the first disciples were called there at the seashore. So a return to the seashore may have, a big significance for the way that the message is revealed and unfolds. Water is a theme that is baptismal, so that is tied to it. The Sea of Galilee is the source of life for the Holy Land, and it is connected to the Jordan River. So there are like a lot of different reasons why that place could be chosen. So then some scholars have, and this is theoretical. So it's not, I don't think there's any way of proving this other than at the very end, when we stand before God and say, so when you walked on the water, did that happen before your resurrection or after? Because we can't really prove it. But one of the very interesting details that is shown is there's a bunch of unique expressions that happen, that occur in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and John about Jesus walking on the sea. And specifically, it is the reaction of the apostles. So there are some, and these are the details. They don't occur in other gospels. And one would say, there were many events, many miracles. There were many times when the disciples saw, for example, think about, when they witnessed Jesus exorcising the demons from the man and casting them into the pigs. That must have been terrifying, when you realize what is happening there. And the disciples were standing right there. They saw these things happen. But never this terminology of fear and apprehension and terror until we get to the resurrection. There we begin to hear different words. And so I'll read from you from Mark chapter 6, verse 47. This is just as a point of reference. Now, when evening came, The boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and told them, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." See, so this, because it's kind of weird. Why would they assume it was a ghost? This doesn't occur anywhere else. This only occurs at the Sea of Galilee. And so based on this reaction, where they see him, and when they see a ghost, what does that mean? Well, a ghost is someone who is dead. And so their reaction, their terror and fear, it is met by his greeting. "Do not be afraid, it is I." And this is repeated. This is repeated often enough in the accounts of the gospel of the resurrection story. So these words, they were terrified. This is echoed also in, this was Mark. In Matthew chapter 14, we read, "They were terrified, saying, 'It is a ghost,' and they cried out in great fear." And then John says, "They saw Jesus walking on the sea, and they were terrified." See, now, the word terrified doesn't appear in other places when it's talking about the emotional distress of the apostles. And so many experts look at this in two ways. We can take it as theoretical, Bible study material. This is what theologians do when they analyze and write enormously long treatises about 3 words in the gospel. We can analyze it that way. But there is a patristic way of reading this, and I think I've mentioned this before, where regardless of this being before the resurrection or after, the text is presenting to us some idea, some image that may be a precursor. It may be giving us a hint of what is to come. So, in some way, it's almost like a glimpse into a prophetic experience, that the fear of the apostles at seeing Jesus walking on the water, and it is a fear that it doesn't recognize him. For one of the evangelists, considers it a ghost, and for John, they recognize him, but they were still terrified. So that whole fear is actually what will occur with them when they initially see the risen Christ. There will be fear. They will think that they've seen a ghost. They will think that the women saw a ghost. They will doubt. They will not believe. So we can take this text, and we can read it in one of 2 ways. You can go very theological and scientific, or using that approach of the fathers, where everything that is in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, can be read in different ways. God is speaking to us. God is showing us truths that are much greater than just the storyline. So, but I think, that's one of the things, since we lack some of the details to say, well, Jesus's appearance at the resurrection, how was it? We can't really answer that question completely. But was there something different? Well, we can read that difference in the reaction of the people who encountered him. That's where we can get the greatest bit of information. So in Luke, we also read that the disciples were startled and terrified, and they thought they were seeing a ghost. This is when they saw Jesus after the resurrection. And then Jesus says in Mark, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And that text is from the episode of the walking on the sea. And then it is in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus says, "It is I, do not be afraid," to the women who are bearing ointment. The other greeting that is also, I think, very important and is repeated is peace. Peace be with you. And we read that in Luke and in John. And I want to go on record as saying this is not simply Jesus using what is a common Jewish or today Israeli greeting, where everybody says shalom, and it's kind of like saying ciao in Italy. But it's actually the peace of God. And so there is a difference. It is peace that is of a very different nature. Jesus says things intentionally. There's nothing accidental about the expression. And of course, there is also the realization that when Jesus says this to his apostles, we first hear this as a greeting when he meets the 10 without Thomas, who are locked behind closed doors for fear of the Jews, because they're worried that they are now on the list, since Jesus's body appears to be missing, and people are saying that he is risen. So they immediately become worried that somehow something will happen to them. And so their reality was completely in turmoil. Not only were they messed up from having lost Jesus through the crucifixion and the sham trial and everything, but now they thought that perhaps they were targets. And so when Jesus appears to them and says, "Peace," that is the peace of God that is now to completely relieve them of their doubts, of their sadness, of their confusion, of their fear. And so it's a peace which is perfect, which has no conditions or stipulations. It is not a peace accord. And of course, it is not just a greeting. It is not just friendly words, but rather it is a profound blessing. That's one of the reasons why that is part of the greetings and blessings that are used in church. So, even things like the sign of peace, the exchange of peace, all of these are part of an expression of reconciliation, but also in an understanding that we as a community have a higher standard for peace. And it is God's peace. It is perfect peace. And it is this piece is predicated by love and forgiveness. And so, that's a very important expression when it comes to this experience of the risen Christ. So anyway, we can look at this experience. There are other narratives in the Gospels where those who have studied the Bible and the New Testament in great detail, the scholars, there are other narratives where they say perhaps this is an image of the risen Christ, and this miracle happened under that context. Again, they do a kind of a detective's job of picking out words and expressions and then matching it up, because the Gospels are a patchwork and they're not necessarily chronological. We'd like to see them as somehow working that way, but it gets even more confusing when we do the comparison of Gospels. So it's like, try to compare it, and it seems that like the Gospels don't sometimes even agree with each other. And so, but that's not so essential. The early church never took that as being, something that created questions about credibility or veracity of the Gospels. It was just something that occurred when you have an oral tradition that became a written tradition after a number of decades after the resurrection and ascension of Christ. And so yes, patchwork, it's okay. One of the problems with biblical scholarship today, and this is why, when you go and read a book, there are many books out there. Always check on the author. Make sure the author is consistent with the teachings of the church. There are many authors who are debunking different parts of the New Testament. And, there are authors who will go as far as even saying that the resurrection never really happened. So you want to be careful what you read, because, even though today sitting here, you may say, well, I have no doubts, but sometimes if you read the wrong stuff, you get those seeds of doubt in your head, and it starts to kind of cause damage and confusion. So, always look up the author. God gave us Google for a reason. You have it on your phone, so it's like when you're at the bookstore, if it doesn't have enough information about the author and where the author is a professor or what he or she has done, then use Google and find out. There are excellent authors who are not Catholic, who are completely consistent with the teachings of the church. And so, so you can find out. So it's not always about Catholicism. And some of the books don't have like the bishop's imprimatur, because they're written for, at a university or published by a university, and they're not required. You get like a book that comes from, for example, Duke University, which is Methodist, and they have some awesome books that they have published, that have no issue with the teachings of the Catholic Church. So it's like, so there's you just kind of have to figure out how to assess the importance or veracity of an author and his or her qualifications, to write a book. But don't be afraid of the interesting and unusual books. Now, conversely, I should say this just to be fair, there are plenty of Catholic authors who stink. So they write books, and some of them may even have imprimatur, but the stuff is a little jumbled. So it's just because the bishop's approval is there doesn't mean it's great. And then there are some of the Catholic authors who don't get the bishop's approval, and they teach errant theology, wrong stuff. And but it's good to get to not be afraid about what's out there. So we'll take Jesus's words to heart. Do not be afraid. One of the problems that I've seen when it comes to going through the Gospels and reading about the resurrection of Christ is, it's one story. It is one narrative. But we get it according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. They don't always jive with each other. Sometimes they seem to almost contradict each other. So what kind of a sense can we make of it? And so this is kind of like the second part of this evening, is to create a narrative which tells the story using the four Gospels to understand the appearances of the risen Christ. So this is not about the appearance or how Jesus looked. This is about him showing himself to the witnesses. And so we're looking specifically, the Gospels we're looking at are Matthew chapter 28, Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, and John chapter 20. And so I've pieced it together to kind of tell a cohesive narrative, a cohesive story about the events of the resurrection and the first witnesses. Each of the Gospels begin with the story of the women at the tomb. The women find the tomb empty, with the stone rolled away. Mary Magdalene, it seems, separated from the other women after the initial visit to the tomb. She hastens off to tell Peter and the other disciple, John. The other 9 apostles were not with Peter and John that morning, that is Easter morning. They were informed, though, of the empty tomb by the other women. Now, in John's Gospel, we read that Mary Magdalene told them that the Lord's body was missing. And so Peter and John, they viewed the tomb and then they left. Mary remained at the tomb weeping, and it was then that she saw the angels, and then she saw the gardener, he who she supposed was the gardener, and it was actually Jesus. Mary Magdalene has a conversation with Jesus, and Jesus sends her, after he reveals himself to her, he sends her to tell his disciples that he is alive. And so she obeys and she goes to the disciples. John and Mark specifically says that Mary was the first to whom Jesus appeared. And the disciples did not initially believe her. Now, the other women, finding the tomb rolled back, they enter into the tomb. They see an angel seated on the right. They realize that actually there are 2 angels. The second angel is mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. Meanwhile, in Mark and Matthew, only one angel is is mentioned. But that could be because only one angel spoke. And so one angel speaks to the women and tells them to go to the disciples and Peter. And that's an interesting statement right there, interesting order, because perhaps it is an indication of some estrangement between Peter and the rest of the disciples. That could be because of Peter's denial of Jesus, because that does come up later on in the gospel story. But nonetheless, that statement of go tell the apostles, or rather the disciples and Peter, is unique. It's not pointing specifically to any sort of preeminence of Peter, or that he is somehow, more important than the others. It's rather stated matter-of-factly, and Peter is not mentioned first, so it's not like, well, Peter was the prince of the apostles, you could write a different story about it, but there's something to be said in the words. And when the other disciples are mentioned first and Peter second, there's something that happened there. The angel also then told the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee, and there they will see Jesus. And then the angel told them to tell them that Jesus was indeed risen. So in the Gospel of Matthew, we read, the women take off running to find the disciples, but they did not find Peter and John, who were already on their way to the tomb, where they would encounter Mary Magdalene. The women ran from the tomb into the city of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Peter and John viewed the empty tomb, and Mary Magdalene encountered Jesus. See, so it's lining up also with the other gospel reading, essentially. After Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, he then appears to the women who were running to the city to tell the disciples. And he himself tells them to tell the disciples that they would see him in Galilee. Why, and this is, you kind of come up with questions. Why would Jesus appear to the women after the angels had already told them to go tell the disciples? And this is where the reading from the Gospel of Mark comes into play. And Mark says that after they saw the angels, and the angels told them, they were so afraid they said nothing to anyone. And so in Mark, we find that. So because of their, I guess you could say, it's not the same fear, but rather I think it's kind of like the state of shock, at having seen angels, the understanding, especially for people of the Old Testament, these Jewish women, where you have angels, there is God. The angels were considered to be like an extension of God himself. And so, that's why in the biblical tradition, the angels speak sometimes as God. So the words they use are not their words, but they're God's words. It's not simply about, that they're the messengers, but they were literally, because they're in the presence of God. So wherever they are, God is. So you could almost say, like, if you want to give it some sort of a physical reality, it's like they would be the fingers, of God. So they're literally, they're not God, but they're connected in a way that we can't even understand. And so, yeah, so when the women come to the tomb and they see these young men in dazzling robes, and they realize that they're angels, I mean, I think that they would be completely overcome with not a terror, or a fear that is like what the apostles had when they locked themselves behind the doors, but rather it is this kind of a realization that God has manifested himself to them right there in the midst of their sorrow, in the midst of the tomb. There is God. And then he says that Jesus is risen. So their fear, I would say, is more of like maybe more of an emotional overload. And so because of that, Jesus then appears to them as they are traveling back into the city, running to find the disciples, to tell them, and maybe their intention wasn't completely clear at that point, and so that's why Jesus appears to them. So he appears to them, and they then are no longer afraid. And so it says that they joyfully delivered his message to the apostles. And then, unfortunately, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 9 says that they heard the women, they heard the news, but they did not believe. So even though they were literally the eyewitnesses, they did not believe. Now, there is other things that are happening. This is all occurring on Sunday morning, the first day of the week, on what we call Easter Sunday. At the same time, there's some other stuff happening too. So in the Gospel of Matthew, we read that the guards who were assigned to take care of the tomb, if you remember, the religious leaders went to Pontius Pilate and they said, it has been brought to our attention that this man said that he would rise from the dead. And so because of that, because we don't want his disciples to steal his body and say he rose from the dead, we don't want to have worse problems. So we ask that you do something to make sure that the tomb stays closed and no one can get to it. Place a guard there. Pontius Pilate was done with dealing with the chief priests. And so he told them, you have your own guards, put your own people there. I don't care. I did my part. That's it. And so they went and they placed seals on the tomb. And the seals would be kind of like, when you have an official document that has the wax seal on it, that type of a seal. So they placed, seal on the tomb to make sure that it would not be violated and would remain closed between the different guards who would come and go. So they had all of this set up. Well, the guards show up on Sunday morning and they say, well, he's gone. And we don't know exactly what they related, if they were witnesses to his resurrection. In many of the paintings and depictions, there are like soldiers or guards that are depicted in the corners, like crouching or hiding from Jesus, who is coming out of the tomb or out of the cave. So, they are an important part. I'm including them because it is alluded that they are witnesses, that they come to tell the high priest, uh, they are then bribed. So they receive, and what Matthew says is a large sum. They receive a large sum of money so that they would spread the lie that the disciples, Jesus's disciples, had come during the night and stolen the body. So they may have been, or it is implied that they saw something of the resurrection. We don't know if maybe Jesus, well, obviously Jesus didn't reveal himself to them, but they are witnesses of some sort. Not good witnesses, and however, still they are a part of the narrative. So then before we get into the other apparitions, in Matthew, continuing after this, the story of the bribe of the guards, we read that the apostles, the 11, went to Galilee, and they saw Jesus, and they worshiped him. Now, the distressing, or I guess the confusing part of that narrative is that it ends with the words, "But some still doubted." And so that's like, so if you're reading the text, it's kind of like, what, huh? After seeing Jesus coming to Galilee, and still some had doubts. I think one of the interesting things, some of the like spiritual authors writing more recent years, so not the fathers necessarily, they make a comparison between Thomas, who is, given the credit as being doubting Thomas. So he gets an epithet that's not all that flattering. And then, the other 10 are all faith-filled because they got to see Jesus. And I think the reality probably is that there was more confusion, that Thomas happened to be quite blunt and honest. He needed more proof. And so he comes out of it glowing. The Christian tradition, the gospel tradition, definitely doesn't focus on him as the doubter, but rather it redeems him. He says, "My Lord and my God." He is the first of the apostles to recognize that Jesus is God. And so, he's come through a process. However, there might be some hypocrites among the other 10 who were like, could this really be? Is this really happening? Did Jesus really die? Maybe they buried him alive. There could be some who were still kind of working through some of their issues. So that's kind of my proposed explanation of that, those mysterious words. I think that the Gospels are so much fun that way because, you can read them and then you get thrown for a loop when they throw at you some expressions like, "Oh, what?" And it kind of, you have to think, well, what is this expressing? Why is this here? None of the words are there by chance. There's something behind them. So you have to consider it. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, because I'm still kind of weaving the story together, the Gospel of Matthew has no reference to any Jerusalem appearance of the risen Christ to his disciples. But Luke and Mark do. And the first part, the other appearances, we hear about a man named Cleopas and his companion, both of whom are disciples. They apparently on Sunday morning had heard the women's account maybe even directly from the women. And they also heard from Peter and John about the fact that the tomb was empty. And so the two of them were traveling in the afternoon, traveling to a town called Emmaus. And on their way, they meet a man who is Jesus, and he explains to them scripture. And then he explains to them how his suffering, death, and resurrection have fulfilled scripture, specifically the prophets in the Old Testament. When they come to Emmaus, Jesus breaks bread and they recognize him. And again, this is not because he's different looking. It's because Jesus did not will to be recognized by them until that point. So it's the breaking. It wasn't even that, all of a sudden he broke bread and they were like, oh, didn't Jesus do that? It wasn't that. It was Jesus who chose that Eucharistic moment to be the moment of revelation. And so they saw him, and then because of that, when they realized that everything that they were told by the women and then the empty tomb, they decided they needed to return right away to Jerusalem, and they made haste and returned to Jerusalem to tell the others. By the others, we figure the apostles as well as other disciples. They told the others, and they were greeted by them with news of the Lord's resurrection, and that Jesus had specifically met Peter. But we don't have other details. In the gospel tradition, it says that the Emmaus disciples report to the 11. That's what it says. And this, again, these are little things which get confusing because it's like, wait, wasn't Thomas not there when they got there? Because Thomas, of course, wasn't there when Jesus came. So what are the possible explanations? Well, we know Thomas wasn't there, so it was just 10. So perhaps when Jesus came, Thomas was out momentarily. Maybe he was there when they initially came. Or perhaps the term the 11 was actually how the church expressed this core group of the apostles. Because we see when in Jesus's ministry and lifetime, so there's reference to the 12. And so perhaps now, since this was without Judas, and before a replacement was elected to take his place, that perhaps the 11 was just a way of expressing the apostles. And so it didn't really matter that one wasn't there. Anytime the apostles were together, if there were 6 of them or 11 of them, they just called them all the 11. That's a theory. It could be, we don't really know, but we do know that Thomas wasn't there. Nonetheless, Thomas would wait 8 days before he would see Jesus. Now, Luke also tells us that there were others present when Jesus came and met the disciples. And specifically in Luke, there is that one encounter with the disciples where Jesus asked, and this is Luke 24, chapter 24, verse 42. Let me read this for you. Now, as they said, I'm starting with verse 36. Now, as they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened, and supposed they had seen a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. But while they still did not believe for joy and marveled, he said to them, "Have you any food here?" So they gave him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate it in their presence. So, and this is one of those texts where you can take it apart a little bit. So he says, "Why do doubts arise in your hearts?" And this is one of the, this is a revelation, a moment of revelation where Jesus is showing his divinity. Only God can read the heart of a person. And so when he makes reference to the heart, that is a very clear indicator. Then secondly, he doesn't have need of nourishment. His body is no longer reliant on the earthly realities of, food and water. And so he does that only to show that his physical body is truly his physical body, that there can be no doubt. And so this revelation right here happens in the presence not only of the 12, but there are also some others who are witnesses to it. Now, Matthew records the Galilean appearances, but Mark and Luke do not record the Galilean appearances. So John in chapter 21 records Jesus instructing his disciples to cast their net on the other side of their boat. And that is when they brought in a miraculous draught of fish. They return to the shore, and Jesus is making them breakfast. And then there is that interesting conversation that also is really fascinating to consider. It is a conversation with Peter. In the Gospel of John, there are 3 apparitions of the risen Christ to his disciples. There is firstly the one to the 10 apostles without Thomas, then the 11 including Thomas, and then the third appearance is in Galilee, fishing, cooking, and commissioning. Sounds like a good theme for a summer camp. But the main part of this event, this narrative, is this conversation between Jesus and Peter. And this is from John chapter 21, verse 15 and following. There are 3 questions that are asked. And the 3 questions are, for all intents and purposes, they're the same question Jesus asks. He says twice, he says, "Do you love me?" Now, the word that he uses, and this is the Greek text, obviously Jesus was not having this conversation in Greek with the disciples, but in Aramaic, which was their spoken language. But Greek does preserve all of the nuances of Aramaic. So the words are chosen very intentionally. So when Jesus says, the first two times he asks Peter, "Do you love me?" The word love, we need to focus on that. The word love is the word agape. And agape literally translated means sacrificial, self-emptying love. The total perfect love that God has for us. That is agape. Now the problem is that Peter answers, and right away with his first answer, he says, "You know that I love you," but he doesn't use the same word. He doesn't use the word agape. He uses the word philo. And that means, it means affection. It is a human love. So it is flawed and faulty and weak. And so there is this distinction in the word love. And we're, in reading the gospel, so the third time that Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" Jesus uses the love word philo, which is the weak human love, as opposed to agape, the divine love. And so, there is this, we get a sense that Peter is hurt. And we can say, in English, we kind of assume it's because he's asking the question 3 times. But in the reading in the Greek original text, since we don't have the Aramaic text, reading in the Greek text, so it's 2 reasons for being hurt. One, because Jesus is asking him 3 times. And secondly, because Jesus has changed the terminology. So he's no longer expecting from Peter the divine, perfect love, but he's settled for the weaker human expression of affection. So it in Greek, it functions in both ways. That's why I think it's so important that we all learn Greek so that we can enjoy the original text in the original language. But anyway, not to get off subject. Now, the interesting part of the conversation, and this is really the beautiful part of the conversation. And, if anything, I would urge you to go and read this text carefully from John. Jesus then tells Peter about how he is going to be arrested and suffer and die. And essentially, Jesus is recognizing that from that moment at the seashore to when he is crucified in the year 67 in Rome by Nero's soldiers, that through these years, his philia, his affection, will become agape, the perfect love. And because, again, this is calling to mind, that there is no greater love than one who dies for his friends. And so it's really a beautiful reflection. This conversation has it contains so much more than just Jesus asking a pretty question and then having that kind of a her reaction. Now, the other thing too, the fathers recognized this experience as being a confession reconciliation experience, because the questions are asked 3 times. And how many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times. So it's in a sense, it is a reconciliation that brings Peter completely back into relationship with God and with Jesus. So it's that's I think that's one of the beautiful stories, narratives of the resurrected Christ. Now there are other appearances of Jesus, and I just like to briefly mention some of the last ones that are not mentioned in the gospel, but they are mentioned in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. And it specifically mentions there that Jesus met with James, the apostle known as the brother of the Lord, the one who was related to Jesus perhaps through Joseph. And this meeting, this encounter happened in Galilee. And it was because of this encounter, this appearance, that James was convinced that Jesus is indeed the Messiah, the Son of God. And that is because, and it's interesting because, again, looking at the gospel connection. So in John chapter 7, verse 5, we read that the brothers of Jesus doubted him. So there's the skepticism is kind of implied. And then at the resurrection, everything is authenticated and verified. And Jesus in the resurrection specifically speaks with his own, brother, half-brother, relative. And also in the same letter to the Corinthians, we read that Jesus does appear again to all the apostles. And then it is recorded also in chapter 1 of the book of the Acts of the Apostles, where Jesus gives the apostles instructions before his ascension. So that is, I think, in kind of a nutshell, a little bit about the appearance and then the appearances of the risen Lord. This is a beautiful season, a season of great hope, a season that reaffirms God's plan for us, a season that renews life, that shows us, and we have all the proof in Jesus himself, where we see his body perfected, transformed and transfigured and glorified. So that is, he becomes, in that sense, he is, as they say, the first fruit of those who have fallen asleep, because he is risen and shows us that which will ultimately happen to each one of us at the time appointed by God himself. So it is good news. It is something to celebrate and something to reconnect, reaffirm our relationship with God, so that this happiness of the resurrection can carry us, through the difficult times, through the losses, through the challenges, through illness, through death, through all those things that are also a part of our human life. But we have hope because of the resurrection. So I open the floor to questions, comments, anything that you would like to share. I think also, your question as a child, the nun did an excellent job in answering, because I think a part of the reality, we who are now more mature, who have lived more life, we now understand, the corruption of, human living, where, as you get older, things happen, you have more aches and pains, there's illness. And so, you can't say that to a little girl that say that, well, you don't experience that because you haven't had that experience as a child yet. And so it's something that we understand better as adults, because it's like, oh, that which is our condition, that which is difficult and hurts and, all that, that's what is gone. It's that which binds us to the earth. I think God does that to give us, their little signs. It's because obviously that person, even if they are, perfectly incorrupt and look as if they're sleeping, that is still the human body. That's not the glorified body. And so it's like, it's in a way, it defies corruption by the will of God. So it points to something greater, but it isn't yet. I think that's a very common question. We don't really know. That's one thing we're not, there's nothing that we can really understand about that, at least from the scriptures. So, it's all going to be on God's terms. But what we do know is, I think at least for our own questions about ourselves. So I think we can get quite a bit of information from, the story of the resurrection. So. Well, the fact that Jesus tells Thomas, put your hand in my side. I mean, it's like, and Jesus is not being, dramatic. The wound that was created there by the spear was big enough that, he could put his hand inside it. Now, those wounds, though, are because they were necessary for the faith, or to erase the doubt of the apostles as well as Thomas. So, but because he's not subject to corruption, wounds normally, even if they're healing, so there's pus, there's blood, there's, you got to bandage it, you have to disinfect. Yeah, there is no corruption. So there's none of that happening. And, you could say that probably, it would be, healed, because it is an imperfection in the body, technically. So, but it had to be, in order for the resurrection to be proven through his body. Because, people, if that was healed, so some people would say that wasn't the same body. That's a kind of that's how we are. We create doubts very easily. Hard to believe little things, but create doubts very easy. Well, and he does go through the doors, so those are all, those kinds of limitations of being within the tomb, or the stone being too heavy for, a human being to move. But with his body, so he no longer knows weakness. And his body is not limited by, the rules of gravity and, living on the earth, because his body now is earthly, but it is transfigured. And so where before, like I said, before his death, he was earthly and more human in what we could see. Now, after his resurrection, he was earthly, but what you see is more divine. Thomas, yes. Thomas is very important because it is through Thomas's doubt that all of us are affirmed. Blessed are those who believe but have not seen. So that's a big statement there. Whereas, Mary is, I would almost say she's more important than Thomas, because her and the women, they were the most faithful of followers of Jesus. None of them disappeared. They were at the cross. They followed his body to the tomb. They observed, they made plans, they made plans to go and give Jesus's body the appropriate burial. And now Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they brought some of the spices and that, but they probably intended themselves to come back and do the appropriate burial according to Jewish tradition. But the women were remarkable because of their own accord. They who are primarily, we have the tradition is of 7 women. And it includes Martha and Mary from Bethany. So 5 of the women are Galilean and 2 of the women are Judean. So that means 5 of them are from very far from home. And so they go and they purchase all of the needed things. The spices were expensive, and it was over 100 pounds of spices and oils. And so they went there knowing that the tomb was guarded, that it was sealed with a boulder, because they witnessed that happening, on Good Friday. And then they also know that according to Jewish tradition, the process of preparation for burial, men prepare men's bodies, women prepare women's bodies. So they were like breaking traditions too. So, the women were extraordinary in what they were heading to do, and much more impressive than the apostles, let me tell you. And then the big reward for all of this is that Mary Magdalene becomes the apostle to the apostles. That's what the church calls her, because she brings the news of the resurrection. She is the first eyewitness of Jesus risen from the dead. So, so I think in a way, yes, she represents also all the women who eventually do see Jesus too, in wanting to embrace him, because they have so faithfully followed him and been completely dedicated and been fearless, in the face of politics, religious persecution, and even the traditions of their identity. So they were completely fearless, and that's the reward that they get to go. And so the fact that he says, I don't think it's such a thing as, that she would somehow have attached herself to him, I think the irony, if anything, is that she obviously wanted to embrace him, and then Thomas, in denying the resurrection of Jesus, so he said he would have to touch Jesus. And so with Mary, she doesn't get to touch Jesus, and then Jesus goes to Thomas and tells him, touch me. So there is a juxtaposition of, great faith and love, and then faulty faith and love, some love. But there's no doubt that there is something to be learned from placing, Mary Magdalene next to Thomas, and understanding, both of these are redeemed, both of these are witnesses of the resurrection, one through great faith and love, one through doubt. So if anything, it validates all of our different and unique journeys, because each one of us has a unique approach and a unique attachment and a unique faith, unique relationship with Jesus and with God in the Trinity. And so it's like, so seeing the way that the resurrection is revealed to these different people in different ways, with different words and conversations and different emotions, I think it validates all of our different experiences too. I think the same thing. I think that Thomas gets a kind of it's a kind of a rough nickname when he's stuck with that, because his experience is a process. I think even the 8 days, it's not, some people think, well, why didn't Jesus appear to him later or something? Why did he have to go through 8 days? And I think the understanding, basically it's 7 days, it's a week, which is considered the perfect quantity of time. And so you have the full experience of life in a week, because that's how creation happens. And so I think although we don't get to share in his journey through the Gospels, but I think it's implied that he had to go through a process and a journey so that he would become ready for the encounter with the risen Christ. And I think that's what that time is. And it's, he is really the most faith-filled one, because he has gone through the effort of figuring things out. And I think that's why then he is given that unique position of being the first of the apostles to profess Jesus as Messiah and God. That's more important. The problem is that the world kind of gave him that nickname of the doubter, but that's not really what it's about. That's just a part of his journey. In the same way that Jesus, when he rises from the dead, he begins by first raising Adam and Eve. So, it's obviously God can make the arrangement and do everything at the same time as he wants. He thinks it happens. So there's no limit to it. I think the expressions are more to do with what we can understand. So it's because, what is the reality of heaven? Well, a lot of us have a very specific image, of what it might look like. How close is that to the reality? Probably not close at all, because we can't really imagine that reality. Our minds are just not that open. We're dealing with a little mind, before the infinite wisdom and, the presence of God. So, yes, I think sometimes when Jesus speaks, very often it's not a reflection on his reality as God and man, but he's speaking to us so that we can comprehend and kind of make a certain image for ourselves. The Aramaic texts, which we do have of the Gospels, are not the pre-Greek texts, but rather they are Aramaic that has been translated from Greek. So there are some pieces of text which are preserved in Aramaic, but very, very, very little. So all of the effort of the church was done to produce the gospel text in Greek, because that was the most common language, and the Greek language was also very sophisticated to express spiritual realities which could not be expressed in Aramaic or in other languages at that time. Okay, it was a pleasure to be with you all. And in 2 weeks, we will be gathering again and talking about wisdom, as far as wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and then also the concepts of divine wisdom, and and discovering also some of the revealed information that we get from the biblical tradition when it comes to wisdom and how we understand it as Christians, as church.
Blessed is the kingdom of the Father and of the Son